Picture two guys sitting next to each other at a high school reunion. The first one walks in wearing a tailored suit, designer watch on his wrist. He mentions casually, twice, that he just got back from a trip to Italy. He drives a 2024 BMW 7 Series. He looks exactly like what everyone imagined making it would look like. The second one shows up in khakis and a plain button-down, drives a 10-year-old Camry. When someone asks how things are going, he says, "Pretty good," and leaves it at that. At the end of the night, everyone is talking about how well the first guy is doing. Nobody gives the second guy a second thought. Here's what nobody at that reunion knows. The first guy has a $1,400 monthly car payment. His suits are on a credit card he's been carrying a balance on since 2019. The Italy trip went on a travel card he opened specifically for the sign-on bonus. His net worth, if you sat down and actually calculated it, is somewhere around $47,000. Most of that is locked in a 401k he can't touch for another 20 years. The second guy paid cash for his Camry 3 years ago. He maxes out his retirement accounts every single year. He owns his house outright. His investment portfolio sits at just under $2.1 million. He could, if he felt like it, never work another day in his life. But nobody at the reunion knows that, because he looks exactly like someone who hasn't done anything special. That's not an accident. That's a strategy. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why looking like you have nothing might be the most powerful financial move available to you, and why the people who figured this out are the ones who actually end up free. Let me ask you something. When you imagine a wealthy person, what do you see? Be honest with yourself. Most people picture something specific: a nice car, an expensive watch, a house in a neighborhood where the lawns are professionally maintained, maybe business class flights, restaurants where the menu doesn't have prices on it. We have a very clear mental image of what wealth looks like. The problem is, that image is almost entirely wrong. Two researchers named Thomas Stanley and William Danko spent years doing something nobody had really done before. They went and actually talked to millionaires. Not the ones on magazine covers, not the ones with television shows. Actual, real, verified millionaires living in actual American neighborhoods. What they found completely demolished everything people assume about wealth. The majority of millionaires in America don't live in the neighborhoods you'd expect. They're not clustered in the expensive zip codes. They're scattered throughout middle-class and working-class communities, driving ordinary cars, living in houses that look exactly like their neighbors' houses. 8 out of 10 of them built their wealth from scratch. No inheritance, no windfall, no lucky break. Just decades of quiet, consistent choices that compound over time. Half of them have lived in the same house for more than 20 years. And the cars? Toyota, Honda, Ford, those are the brands that show up over and over again when you look at what actual millionaires drive. Not because they can't afford something different, because they made a deliberate choice about what their money is actually for. Here's the number that should stop you cold. 8% of people earning under $100,000 a year own luxury vehicles. They're spending $60,000 or $70,000 on a car while bringing home $50,000 a year. Meanwhile, the majority of people with actual 7-figure net worths are driving cars that wouldn't turn a single head in a strip mall parking lot. One group looks wealthy. One group actually is wealthy. These are almost never the same people. And understanding why requires going back to something a sociologist named Thorstein Veblen figured out over 100 years ago. Veblen noticed something that seems obvious once you hear it, but somehow never occurs to most people. He noticed that humans don't just buy things because they need them. They buy things because of what those things communicate to other people. He called it conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous meaning visible. Visible on purpose. A $400 handbag carries your belongings just as effectively as a $40,000 handbag. The extra $39,600 isn't buying you a better bag. It's buying you a signal. It's buying you a story that gets told to everyone who sees it. The luxury industry understood this before Veblen gave it a name. They're not selling leather and hardware. They're selling the experience of being seen as someone who can afford leather and hardware at a certain price point. And we buy it. Constantly, compulsively, often without realizing we're doing it. Because somewhere along the way, we absorbed a belief that goes something like this. Successful people look successful. If you've made it, you show it. And if you don't show it, either you haven't made it or you're hiding something. This belief is so deep in the culture that most people never question it. But it has a cost that almost nobody calculates until it's too late. Let's talk about a car. Not because cars are uniquely important, but because they're the clearest example of how visible consumption destroys invisible wealth. Imagine two people, same age, same income. Let's say they both earn $90,000 a year. They both need a car. Person A decides to buy something that reflects their success. They finance a $65,000 SUV. Monthly payment around $1,100 for 72 months. Insurance goes up, maintenance costs more, registration fees are higher. All in, they're spending roughly $1,400 a month on this vehicle. Person B buys a 3-year-old reliable sedan for $22,000 cash. No payment, lower insurance, standard maintenance. All in, maybe $200 a month to keep it running. The difference between those two choices is $1,200 a month. Over 1 year, that's $14,400. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's the number that should make your stomach drop a little. If person B takes that $1,200 monthly difference and invests it consistently at a 7% average annual return, which is roughly what broad market index funds have historically delivered, here's what happens over time. After 10 years, approximately $208,000. After 20 years, approximately $590,000. After 30 years, approximately $1.4 million. One car choice. One moment of deciding what kind of signal you want to send. And the downstream consequence, played out over a working lifetime, is the difference between financial freedom and financial fragility. That $65,000 SUV didn't just cost $65,000. It cost $1.4 million in future wealth. That's its real price. That's what you're actually paying when you buy the status instead of the transportation. Now multiply that across every purchase. The watch that costs $12,000 instead of $200 a month. The apartment in the trendy neighborhood that costs $3,500 a month instead of $1,800. The wardrobe that gets refreshed every season. The dinners at the restaurants where the bill makes you slightly uncomfortable, but you don't say anything because you don't want to look like you can't afford it. Each individual choice feels manageable. They're rounding errors on a good salary. But they're not rounding errors. They're compounding decisions. And the compound effect works in both directions. Money invested compounds upward over decades. Money spent on visible consumption is gone permanently, and so is every dollar it would have generated if it had been invested instead. There's a concept in economics called opportunity cost. It's the value of the thing you didn't choose when you made a choice. Every dollar has an opportunity cost. The question is whether you're being honest with yourself about what that cost actually is. A 2025 study found that 62% of people who have actually crossed the $1 million threshold still budget carefully, still look for deals, still avoid spending money on things that don't genuinely improve their lives. They understand something at a bone-deep level that most people only understand intellectually. The habits that build wealth and the habits that destroy wealth are the same habits. The only difference is direction. Someone who earns $200,000 a year and saves 5% of it will accumulate roughly $680,000 over 25 years. Someone who earns $200,000 a year and saves 25% of it will accumulate roughly $3.4 million over the same period. Same income, same years, 5 times the outcome. The first person looks wealthy. The second person actually is wealthy. You already know which car each of them drives. There's a dimension to visible wealth that most people never consider until it becomes a problem. Visible wealth makes you a target, not metaphorically, literally. Research from Javelin, a financial crime analytics firm, found that high net worth individuals, people with assets over $1 million, are 43% more likely to experience identity theft than the general population. The more visibly wealthy you appear, the more data points you're providing to people who are actively looking for targets. Think about what happens when you signal wealth publicly. You post photos of your new car on social media. Now, anyone paying attention knows you have money and knows you're willing to spend it on expensive things. You mention your vacation home in conversation. Now people you barely know have a piece of your financial picture. You wear the watch that anyone who follows certain online communities can immediately identify as worth $15,000 or $25,000 or more. You're broadcasting constantly, and most of the people receiving that broadcast are completely indifferent. But some of them aren't. Criminals who target wealthy individuals don't use the same tactics they use on everyone else. They don't send mass phishing emails hoping someone clicks. They build profiles. They research. They gather information from social media, from data brokers, from public records. They construct a detailed picture of who you are, who you bank with, who advises you, who your family members are. Then they use that picture to craft something that looks exactly legitimate enough to work. An email that appears to come from your financial advisor. A phone call from someone who knows enough details about your life that it feels real. A text message with just enough specifics to seem authentic. This is called a whaling attack. It's specifically designed for high-value targets, and it works because the target has made themselves visible. The Federal Trade Commission reported that Americans lost $10.3 billion to fraud in a single year. The disproportionate share of those losses came from the demographic that was most visibly presenting themselves as having something worth taking. But the targeting isn't just criminal. Everyone in your life calibrates their behavior based on their perception of your financial position. The contractor who drives into your driveway looks at your car, looks at your house, and makes a mental estimate before he ever opens his toolbox. If that estimate is high, his quote reflects it. The car dealership, the real estate agent, the service provider of any kind, they all use visible signals to estimate what you can afford, and they price accordingly. Warren Buffett, the third or fourth wealthiest person on the planet, depending on the day, lived for decades without most people he encountered having any idea who he was. He drove himself to work. He ate at ordinary restaurants. He was treated like an ordinary person in most ordinary transactions. He noted once that this was not incidental. The invisibility had real, practical value. It meant nobody was pricing things based on who he was. He negotiated from a position of perceived ordinariness, which meant he negotiated from a position of strength. Looking wealthy is a tax. You pay it on everything. You pay it to contractors and dealers and service providers who see your signals and adjust accordingly. You pay it to criminals who see your signals and see opportunity. You pay it in social dynamics, where everyone around you recalibrates their expectations based on what they perceive you to have. Looking ordinary is a discount, applied to everything, for life. Here's something the financial advice world almost never talks about. Visible wealth quietly poisons relationships. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly, in ways that are hard to trace back to their source. Think about what happens when you become visibly successful in a social circle where not everyone is at the same level. The dinners start requiring more expensive restaurants because you picked one last time and now the baseline has shifted. Friends feel slightly awkward asking you to split checks evenly when they perceive that you could easily cover the whole thing. A quiet resentment begins to develop that nobody names, but everyone feels. The dynamics of every interaction become filtered through the lens of perceived financial inequality. Research on social comparison shows that status is inherently relational. It only exists relative to other people. And in environments where visible wealth creates obvious tiers, the comparisons become more intense, not less. The quietly wealthy person avoids this entirely. If nobody knows you have money, nobody treats you like you have money. Friendships stay horizontal. The check gets split evenly. Nobody feels like they owe you anything or like you owe them anything. The relationship is just a relationship, undistorted by financial perception. There's something even more significant happening with family. Research found a striking negative correlation between the amount of money parents give adult children and the amount of wealth those children eventually build on their own. The more financial support children receive, the less they accumulate independently. Not because receiving money makes people lazy in some moral sense, but because it subtly shifts their self-perception. They start to see their financial security as partially external rather than fully self-generated. The hustle softens. Parents who look wealthy face constant implicit and explicit pressure to share that wealth. Adult children plan their finances around an expected inheritance. Extended family develops resentments or expectations based on visible disparity. Parents who look middle class while quietly building wealth avoid all of this. Their children develop a fully internal sense of financial capability because they never had reason to believe there was a safety net. Their relationships with extended family are uncomplicated by visible inequality. The invisible wealthy parent can choose to help strategically, quietly, on their own terms, without the social dynamics that visible wealth creates around every interaction. And then there's the loneliest part of visible wealth that people rarely discuss. When people know you have money, you can never fully know if they like you or your money. Every new friend, every potential partner, every professional relationship carries that question underneath it. Is this real, or is this about what I represent to them financially? The person who looks ordinary never has to ask that question. Their relationships weren't filtered through the lens of perceived wealth in the first place. What they have is what's real. That's something you genuinely cannot buy once visible wealth has already colored how people perceive you. There's a concept in psychology called hedonic adaptation. It describes something that happens to all of us, but that almost none of us account for when we're making financial decisions. Hedonic adaptation is the process by which new things stop feeling new. You buy the car you've been wanting. For the first few weeks, every drive feels like a reward. You notice it when you walk toward it in a parking lot. The smell of the interior still catches you. You're genuinely happier. 3 months later, it's just your car. You don't think about it. You don't feel it. It's background. The expensive watch follows the same arc. The bigger apartment, the designer wardrobe, the upgraded vacation. Every status purchase delivers a spike of pleasure that flattens out and disappears faster than you expected it to. Then the cycle starts again, because the only way to recreate the spike is to upgrade again. This is the treadmill that visible consumption builds. You can run on it your entire adult life and arrive at retirement having bought enormous amounts of temporary pleasure that long ago became permanent background. What you can't buy back is the time those purchases cost you, the years of working to service payments, the decades of compound growth that didn't happen because the money went to signals instead of investments. Now, contrast this with what happens when you build invisible wealth. The security doesn't adapt away. Knowing that you could handle any emergency, really knowing it, not just hoping it's true, provides a constant psychological foundation that doesn't diminish with time. Knowing that you could walk away from a job that's making you miserable without catastrophic financial consequences changes how you carry yourself every single day. Knowing that your future is protected creates a kind of background calm that influences every decision, every relationship, every experience you have. That security compounds too in its own way. As the number grows, the security deepens, the freedom expands, the options multiply. And unlike the BMW, it never just becomes background. There's also something that happens to decision-making when financial anxiety is removed. Study after study shows that financial stress consumes cognitive resources. It makes people more short-term focused, more risk-averse in counterproductive ways, more likely to make decisions driven by fear rather than clarity. Financial scarcity, or the fear of it, literally reduces the bandwidth available for good thinking. The invisible wealthy person makes decisions from a fundamentally different psychological position. They're not desperate. They're not afraid. They're not calculating whether they can afford to take a risk or stand up for themselves or walk away from something that isn't working. This isn't just pleasant. It's strategically powerful. An employee who doesn't genuinely need their job negotiates differently than one who does. An entrepreneur who has a financial cushion can wait for the right opportunity instead of taking the first one that comes along out of pressure. A person who knows their future is secure can afford to be generous, patient, and genuinely present in relationships in ways that financially anxious people simply cannot. Invisible wealth isn't just about having money. It's about what having money, quietly, invisibly, does to how you move through the world. Everything in this video so far has been descriptive. Here's the part that's actually useful. The strategy has 3 components. They're not complicated, but they require something that's genuinely difficult in the world we live in, which is the willingness to let people think less of you than you actually deserve. The first component is ruthless clarity about what things are actually for. Most purchases in the status category aren't really about the thing. They're about the signal. And once you name that honestly, you can make a much cleaner decision. When you're standing in front of a $1,200 jacket and a $120 jacket, the honest question isn't which one is nicer. The honest question is, who am I trying to impress? And is impressing them worth $1,080 in permanent capital? Sometimes the answer is yes. There are contexts where presentation genuinely matters and the investment makes sense. But most of the time, when you ask the question honestly, the answer is that you're buying the signal for an audience that won't notice or remember it within a week. The person who builds invisible wealth has trained themselves to ask this question automatically, not as a punishment, not as deprivation, but as clarity. They know what they're buying and why, and they've decided that compound growth over decades is worth more to them than temporary social approval. The second component is designing your social environment intentionally. The research on this is clear and slightly uncomfortable. The spending baseline of the people around you is one of the strongest predictors of your own spending baseline, not because of peer pressure in any explicit sense, but because of what feels normal. When everyone in your social circle takes international vacations twice a year, 2 international vacations a year starts to feel like the minimum. When everyone drives luxury vehicles, driving a modest car starts to feel like a statement rather than a default. The invisible wealthy person doesn't necessarily isolate themselves from ambitious or successful people, but they're deliberate about not allowing their baseline of normal to be set by the spending habits of people who are playing a different game. This sometimes requires some social courage. It requires being the person at the table who orders the mid-range option without apologizing, being the person who drives the ordinary car without feeling like it reflects something about their worth, being comfortable over time with people underestimating what you have. That comfort, it turns out, is worth cultivating because it removes an enormous amount of pressure that most people are carrying around without realizing it. The third component is treating invisibility as a feature rather than a flaw. This is the mindset shift that makes everything else sustainable. Most people experience frugality as sacrifice. They feel the absence of the thing they didn't buy. Every sensible decision registers as a deprivation rather than a choice. The invisible wealthy person experiences those same decisions differently. Not buying the expensive car isn't about not having the expensive car. It's about what that money becomes over the next 30 years. The Camry in the parking lot isn't a symbol of limitation. It's a symbol of a decision that's quietly compounding in the background. When you make that shift, the whole dynamic changes. You stop feeling deprived. You start feeling strategic. Every ordinary choice becomes evidence of a larger plan that most people around you have no idea you're executing. The people who assume you're struggling aren't insulting you. They're confirming that the strategy is working.
Go back to those 2 guys at the high school reunion. The one in the tailored suit with the BMW in the parking lot. The one in khakis with the 10-year-old Camry. Here's the thing about the guy in the suit. He's not doing anything wrong. He's not a bad person. He's doing exactly what the culture trained him to do from the moment he was old enough to understand that certain things signal certain things about a person. He just never questioned whether the signal was worth the cost. He never did the math on what that signal costs in compound terms over a lifetime. He never asked who he was actually performing for and whether their opinion of his car was worth $270,000 in foregone wealth. He never noticed the tax he was paying on everything, all the time, just for the privilege of looking like he'd made it. He never considered that the person next to him in the parking lot, driving the forgettable car, might have made it in a way that actually means something.
Freedom. Not the appearance of freedom, not the performance of freedom, the actual thing, where your choices are genuinely your own, because you built a foundation underneath them that nobody can see, nobody can target, nobody can distort with their expectations or their resentment or their assumptions about what you owe them. The most subversive financial move you can make in a culture that measures success by what's visible is to build success that's invisible. Let them look at the car. Let them draw their conclusions. Let them feel whatever they feel about what they think they see. Meanwhile, the number keeps growing, quietly, invisibly, compounding in the background of an ordinary life that most people will completely underestimate.
until the day they don't have to anymore. That's the strategy. That's the whole thing. The question is whether you're willing to let people think less of you than you are. The ones who answer yes are the ones who end up free.